Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the 15-Minute Book Club. I'm your host, David Wares, and this episode was produced by Wilson and Warm Winter Productions. It was brought to the World Wide Web by our man in Yucatan, keeper of the electronic carrier pigeons, El Gavster. If you'd like to subscribe or get involved with the podcast, feel free. We're at the stage where we're still building the concept of the show, so we welcome fresh ideas and new supporters. So, it's January. We're triple jabbed, but we're still enduring lockdown purgatory. The world is mostly shut down and the skies are grey. But not to worry, we're here to provide something worth listening to. That is, if you like books and the written word. And today, we're going to talk about George Orwell. Why George Orwell, I hear you say? Well, I was chatting to an American friend of mine about tea. Being American, being an English teacher, indeed a self-confessed English ninja, and being a teacher English, she tells me her family worry for her sanity. But being English for me, tea, well, it's the thing. One of my favourite Englishmen, George Orwell, wrote a classic essay on the topic of tea, and on this episode I'm going to revisit that essay, which is called A Nice Cup of Tea, and which was published in January 1946, just a few months after the end of World War II. At a time when Britain was still in the midst of rationing, was still demobilising an army of millions, and still coming to terms with the ruinous cost of fighting the fascists of Germany and Italy and the almost psychotic Imperial Japanese Army, a war that we were still paying for some 60 years later. Britain was battered, broke and bombed almost into oblivion. So what do the British, especially the English, do when they're in a tough situation? Well, of course, they put on a kettle and make a pot of tea. In fact, shortly before the war began, the English government wisely sent out merchants to scour Europe, and they bought up every pound, every bag, every chest of tea on the continent because they knew we were going to need it. Tea was and is a core element of our culture. In any stressful situation, whether waiting for an exam result, waiting for bad news, or just hoping things are going to improve, there's always someone ready to put on the kettle and make a cup of tea to soothe our nerves. And currently we are under attack. Certainly we're not involved in a hot war with millions of casualties, but our lifestyles and freedoms are under assault. We're fighting a man-made virus developed by mad scientists working outside the boundaries of safety and common sense and human concern. And we're assailed by self-appointed authoritarians who seek to restrict our historical freedoms and control our every move, who seek to diminish our agency on the pretext of looking out for our well-being. So maybe it is time for us to hoy on the kettle and make a pot of tea. So with that outline of the context, both historical and current, I'm going to read Orwell's essay. And as I do, I'd like you to listen out for the many anachronisms in the text, spot just how many things in our culture have changed. We don't have rationing anymore, nor do we use ounces as a measure of weight, but there are many, many cultural references in this essay that probably are completely alien to most people now. In the 75 years since this essay was written, the world has changed. Our lives are in a state of flux, our rights are being dismantled, and the question we face is, how do we retain our sense of what is correct, what is right, what is reasonable, all essential elements of our culture? And here's Orwell writing shortly after that same question was asked of our grandparents and our great-grandparents. A Nice Cup of Tea by George Orwell. If you look up tea in the first cookery book that comes to hand, you will probably find that it is unmentioned, or at most you will find a few lines of sketchy instructions which give no ruling on several of the most important points. This is curious not only because tea is one of the mainstays of civilization in this country, as well as in Era, Australia and New Zealand, but because the best manner of making it is a subject of violent disputes. When I look through my own recipe for the perfect cup of tea, I find no fewer than 11 outstanding points. On perhaps 2 of them there would be pretty general agreement, but at least 4 others are acutely controversial. Here are my own level rules. every one of which I regard as golden. First of all, one should use Indian or Ceylonese tea. China tea has virtues which are not to be despised nowadays. It is economical and one can drink it without milk, but there is not much stimulation in it. One does not feel wiser, braver, or more optimistic after drinking it. Anyone who's used that comforting phrase, a nice cup of tea, invariably means India tea. Secondly, tea should be made in small quantities, that is, in a teapot. Tea out of an urn is always tasteless, while army tea made in a cauldron tastes of grease and whitewash. The teapot should be made of china or earthenware. Silver or Britannia-ware teapots produce inferior tea, and enamel pots are worse. Though curiously enough, a pewter teapot, a rarity nowadays, is not so bad. Thirdly, the pot should be warmed beforehand. This is better done by placing it on the hob than by the usual method of swilling it out with hot water. Fourthly, the tea should be strong. For a pot holding a quart, if you are going to fill it nearly to the brim, 6 heaped teaspoons will be about right. In a time of rationing, this is not an idea that can be realised on every day of the week, but I maintain that one strong cup of tea is better than 20 weak ones. All true tea lovers not only like their tea strong, but like it a little stronger with each year that passes, a fact which is recognised in the extra ration issued to old age pensioners. Fifthly, the tea should be put straight into the pot. No strainers, muslin bags, or other devices to imprison the tea. In some countries, teapots are fitted with little dangling baskets under the spout to catch the stray leaves, which are supposed to be harmful. Actually, one can swallow tea leaves in considerable quantities without ill effect, and if the tea is not loose in the pot, it never infuses properly. Sixthly, one should take the teapot to the kettle and not the other way about. The water should actually be boiling at the moment of impact, which means that one should keep it on the flame while one pours. Some people add that one should only use water that has been freshly brought to the boil, but I've never noticed that it makes any difference. Seventhly, after making the tea, one should stir it, or better, give the pot a good shake, afterwards allowing the leaves to settle. Eighthly, one should drink out of a good breakfast cup, that is, the cylindrical type of cup, not the flat, shallow type. The breakfast cup holds more, and with the other kind, one's tea is always half cold before one has well started on it. Ninthly, one should pour the cream off the milk before using it for tea. Milk that is too creamy always gives a sickly taste. Tenthly, one should pour tea into the cup first. This is one of the most controversial points of all. Indeed, in every family in Britain, there are probably 2 schools of thought on the subject. The milk first school can bring forward some fairly strong arguments, but I maintain that my own argument is unanswerable. This is that by putting the tea in first and stirring as one pours, one can exactly regulate the amount of milk, whereas one is liable to put in too much milk if one does it the other way around. Lastly, tea, unless one is drinking it in the Russian style, should be drunk without sugar. I know very well that I am in a minority here, but still, how can you call yourself a true tea lover if you destroy the flavour of your tea by putting sugar in it? It will be equally reasonable to put in pepper or salt. Tea is meant to be bitter, just as beer is meant to be bitter. If you sweeten it, you are no longer tasting the tea, you are merely tasting the sugar. You could make a very similar drink by dissolving sugar in plain hot water. Some people will answer that they don't like tea in itself, that they only drink it in order to be warmed and stimulated, and that they need sugar to take the taste away. To those misguided people, I would say, try drinking tea without sugar for, say, a fortnight, and it is very unlikely that you will ever want to ruin your tea by sweetening it again. These are not the only controversial points to arise in connection with tea drinking, but they are sufficient to show how subtilised the whole business has become. There is also the mysterious social etiquette surrounding the teapot. Why is it considered vulgar to drink out of your saucer, for instance? And much might be written about the subsidiary uses of tea leaves, such as telling fortunes, predicting the arrival of visitors, feeding rabbits, healing burns, and sweeping the carpet. It's worth paying attention to such details as warming the pot and using water that is really boiling so as to make quite sure of wringing out one's ration. The 20 good, strong cups that 2 ounces properly handled ought to represent. So that was George Orwell writing about one of the central cultural pillars of our society, tea. How many cultural anachronisms did you spot? This essay is about the same age as your grandparents, and yet it references a time that is almost beyond our comprehension. What is Russian-style tea? Why did pensioners get more tea in their rations than other people? In fact, what are rations and who supplied them? Why was army tea boiled in a cauldron? Where or what is Ceylonese? Why did people drink their tea from a saucer? Does anyone even use a saucer now? Never mind drink their tea from it. And the most important question, does anyone use loose tea leaves to make their tea anymore? Answers on a postcard. But setting aside those anachronisms, I think in this essay, George Orwell was reasserting the ordinary, cheerful Englishness that had helped us survive a war, the second such war in less than 30 years. He was making a case for the mundane, for the everyday, for the huge part that ordinary things play in the maintenance of society. It's no exaggeration to say that tea sustained Britain through a war that could have destroyed us. It represented a quality of ordinariness that sustained us. And now, best part of a century later, I have to ask, what ordinary things sustain us? When our freedoms, our democratic will, our right to act and speak with impunity are denigrated or attacked and dismantled, what mundane, day-to-day values unite us? And on that bombshell question, this is the 15-minute book club. We'll see you next week for something completely different.